und Chudowo, eine wichtige Bahnstation südlich Petersburg. Die Sowjets werfen immer neue Reserven an die Front.
In the convulsed Europe that emerged after the First World War, two antagonistic ideologies began to grow as forces that not only competed for power, but conceived of each other as existential threats. National Socialism, with its emphasis on racial hierarchy, authoritarian leadership and expansionist militarism, saw in communism a heresy destined to annul the social and racial order it intended to impose. In turn, Soviet communism considered National Socialism a tool of the bourgeoisie to crush the working class and halt any revolutionary attempt. When Adolf Hitler wrote Mein Kampf in the 1920s, he defined Jewish Bolshevism as the greatest threat to Germany and Europe. That conviction guided his political project and sealed the fate of millions in Eastern Europe. Despite this ideological hostility, relations between Germany and the Soviet Union had moments of pragmatism. After the German defeat in 1918, the Weimar Republic found in Moscow an unexpected partner to evade the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles. The Rapallo Agreement of 1922 restored diplomatic relations and opened the door to secret military cooperation, weapons testing, pilot training, and the manufacture of prohibited tanks. Although it was based on circumstantial interests, this collaboration even survived Hitler's rise in 1933, despite the fact that the Führer publicly proclaimed that the Soviet Union was the racial and ideological enemy of the Reich. With the arrival of the Nazi regime, the relationship between Berlin and Moscow was marked by distrust. Stalin cautiously observed German rearmament and the alliances Hitler was weaving in Central Europe. He tried to build a defensive bloc with France and Czechoslovakia, but ran into French indecision, British appeasement, and the fear of Eastern countries of being caught between two powers. The Munich Conference in 1938, with the handover of Czechoslovakia to the Reich, confirmed to Stalin that the Western democracies would not confront Germany. For Hitler, on the other hand, the East represented the vital space indispensable for his racial project. This concept of Lebensraum, or living space, implied colonizing Slavic territories and subjecting their populations to a German imperial order in which millions would be displaced, enslaved or exterminated. But before advancing on the Soviet Union, Hitler needed to isolate Poland and ensure that the Western powers did not interfere. Nazi foreign policy combined audacity, pragmatism and strategic urgency, which led him to consider a temporary agreement with the Soviet Union. Stalin, aware that the Red Army was weakened by the purges of 1937 to 1938 and that the ongoing industrialization required time, saw in a pact with his ideological enemy a necessary evil. He sought time to strengthen defense and avoid a premature war. Thus it was that on the 23rd of August, 1939, the German minister Joachim von Ribbentrop and his Soviet counterpart Vyacheslav Molotov signed in Moscow the non-aggression pact that would bear their names. The agreement established that both powers renounced attacking each other and avoided supporting third parties in aggressions against the other. But what was decisive was its secret protocol, which drew lines on the map: partition of Poland, Soviet dominion over the Baltic states, and German freedom in Western Europe. The pact surprised the world and transformed strategic calculations. With the Soviet Union temporarily neutralized, Hitler gained room to attack Poland without fear of an immediate war on two fronts. For his part, Stalin took advantage of this understanding to expand his influence. He annexed Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, occupied Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, and advanced into territories he considered essential for Soviet security. Despite the tactical understanding, neither side believed in the durability of the pact. Hitler remained obsessed with destroying Jewish Bolshevism. Stalin knew that sooner or later Germany would seek to expand eastward. However, for almost 2 years, both countries maintained an economic cooperation that sustained the German war industry with Soviet oil, grain, and raw materials. The first test of this pact came on the 1st of September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. Nazi propaganda presented the attack as a defensive action, relying on fabricated incidents such as that of Gleiwitz, but in reality, it responded to the secret agreements with Moscow. Hitler trusted that the speed of the offensive would paralyze the Western powers. The Wehrmacht advanced rapidly, combining armor, mobile artillery, and coordinated air support. The Polish lines collapsed quickly. On the 17th of September, with the Polish army on the verge of defeat, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, fulfilling the agreed territorial division. Encounters between Soviet and German officers in Brest-Litovsk displayed a momentary tactical understanding. This campaign ended in 5 weeks, reinforcing the image of an unstoppable Wehrmacht. Although the victory was due in part to Polish limitations and strategic surprise, Hitler interpreted the result as confirmation of the effectiveness of his blitzkrieg doctrine. Between 1939 and 1940, while the West lived the phony war, Germany increased its military capacity. The Luftwaffe reached its maximum power before the subsequent attrition. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union used the time to absorb the occupied territories and strengthen its position in the Baltic. Although the pact continued to operate, the political climate was beginning to change. The German invasion of Denmark and Norway in April 1940 showed the Reich's ability to operate on multiple fronts, albeit at significant cost. Those triumphs increased Hitler's self-confidence, which turned into overconfidence. This overconfidence reached its peak with the offensive against France, Belgium, and the Netherlands on the 10th of May 1940. The speed of the operation astonished the world. The Wehrmacht passed through the Ardennes, considered impassable for armored forces, and broke the French defenses. The coordination between ground and air forces was presented as operational perfection, and the concept of blitzkrieg became popular to describe that combination of mobility, surprise, and concentration of force. Paris fell on the 14th of June, and the armistice was signed on the 22nd. In 6 weeks, Germany defeated one of the most prestigious military powers in Europe. This triumph reinforced in Hitler the conviction that his strategic intuition was superior to that of his generals, and that the same formula would be enough to destroy the Soviet Union. Intoxicated by these victories in Poland and France, the German High Command seriously considered what Hitler already saw as an inevitable destiny: expansion eastward. The Führer repeated that the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay, incapable of resisting a modern campaign. The Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union reinforced that perception by exposing the tactical and organizational weaknesses of the Red Army, weakened by the purges. Although the Soviets suffered enormous losses, they learned quickly and forced Finland to cede territory. For Hitler, however, the dominant message was that the Soviet Union was incompetent and vulnerable. Convinced of this weakness, in July 1940, weeks after the French collapse, Hitler summoned his general staff to evaluate the possibility of attacking the Soviet Union. General Franz Halder, chief of the Army High Command, was tasked with preparing the preliminary studies. He shared the Führer's ideological vision, though with greater professional caution. The conviction persisted that a rapid campaign would suffice to destroy the Red Army near the border. This premise permeated all debates. Intelligence reports seriously underestimated the real size of the Soviet army and assumed that the Luftwaffe would repeat its success in France. To carry out these plans, General Friedrich Paulus, Deputy Chief of the General Staff, coordinated the technical elaboration of the first operational drafts, assigning routes and objectives on an immense front. But his work depended on the premise imposed by Hitler. The campaign had to be rapid, decisive, and aimed at massively destroying Soviet forces. In that command structure coexisted the OKH, responsible for directing the army, and the OKW, the High Command of the Wehrmacht, directly subordinate to Hitler and turned into his political military instrument. Tensions between the two grew as planning progressed. The OKH insisted on traditional military criteria. Hitler, backed by the OKWW, imposed ideological criteria. The war against the Soviet Union would be a racial war, not a conventional one. These criteria were set down in Directive No. 21, signed in December 1940, known as Barbarossa, which established a lightning strike against the Western Soviet Union. It was expected that the bulk of the Red Army would be destroyed before it could withdraw into the interior. Calculations predicted a Soviet collapse in 4 to 6 weeks, an optimism more ideological than realistic. Hitler ignored warnings about logistics or Soviet industrial capacity. He believed that communism was inherently weak and would collapse if its Western power centers were destroyed. He did not consider Soviet strategic depth or its ability to relocate factories and endure enormous sacrifices. According to this final plan, 3 axes were defined: Army Group North towards Leningrad, center towards Moscow, and south towards Ukraine. The division of efforts already contained the seed of failure, but German faith in their own superiority prevented serious questioning. By January 1941, Barbarossa was outlined. Troops and supplies were secretly moved to Poland and Romania, while Stalin continued sending food and oil to Germany, unaware that on the other side of the railway divisions destined for the largest invasion in modern history were accumulating. However, the operation was born with a decisive flaw: the absence of a single strategic objective. Hitler and his generals debated without agreement among 3 possible targets: Moscow, Ukraine, or Leningrad. For the OKH, Moscow was the key, the center of Soviet communications, transport, and command. Halder insisted that only a decisive battle before the capital would definitively destroy the Red Army, but Hitler distrusted that view. He considered Moscow an overrated symbol by the military. His priority was Ukraine, the indispensable agricultural heart for his Lebensraum project. The region offered food and essential industrial centers for his imperial vision. Leningrad, as a third possible objective, offered strategic and symbolic value, control of the Baltic and a blow to the cradle of the revolution. But Hitler insisted on pursuing all 3 objectives simultaneously. This dispersion stemmed from his racial view of the enemy. He assumed the Soviet Union would collapse regardless of the point of attack. Thus, Barbarossa was burdened with contradictory objectives and contaminated by ideological considerations that replaced military analysis. This ideological vision was clearly reflected in documents such as the General Plan Ost, which revealed that the war sought not only to defeat the Red Army, but to ethnically redesign Eastern Europe. Millions would be displaced or eliminated. The territory was to be reorganized to serve the German economy through slave labor. Logistics and military needs were subordinated to this radicalized racial vision. Such strategic confusion was also reflected in the command structure. Hitler, emboldened by his victories, increasingly intervened in operational decisions. He ordered forces from Army Group Center to be diverted towards Ukraine, altering the original plan and delaying the offensive towards Moscow. These interferences, motivated by racial ideals and political calculations, would generate tensions that would mark the entire campaign. All this planning process took place in an intellectual atmosphere steeped in racial supremacism. Internal reports described the Soviet enemy as primitive and chaotically organized, completely ignoring its industrial and military capacity. Racial prejudices replaced strategic analysis, creating a false sense of superiority that would become one of the roots of the disaster. Thus, the invasion of the Soviet Union was born with a scattered structure and poorly defined objectives. At the beginning of 1941, while German troops were massing in Poland and Romania, Hitler and the High Command still could not agree on what the decisive blow should be. The OKH argued that Moscow was the strategic and logistical priority, but Hitler insisted on dividing efforts between Leningrad, Ukraine, and the Soviet capital, an indecision fed by an ideological vision that profoundly underestimated the enemy and which permeated the entire operational design. The German machine at its peak, blitzkrieg in the east. On the 22nd of June 1941, when the first shots rang out along the border between Germany and the Soviet Union, the largest military operation ever organized in human history was set in motion. The scale of the attack had no precedent. More than 3 million German and Allied soldiers were deployed along 2,400 kilometers of front, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. No previous campaign had demanded such vast coordination, and no other would push to the limit an army whose very initial success would conceal the structural defects that would eventually consume it. The German deployment was divided into 3 large army groups, each with different and, in theory, complementary objectives. The Army Group North, commanded by Wilhelm von Lieb, was to advance from East Prussia towards the Baltic countries with the final objective of capturing Leningrad. Its forces included the 16th and 18th Armies, as well as the 4th Panzer Group, tasked with opening the penetration routes. This zone combined dense forests, complex rivers and limited infrastructure, but the Wehrmacht trusted that the initial surprise would shatter any Soviet attempt at organized resistance. In the center was the most powerful element of the offensive, Army Group Center, led by Fedor von Bock. This sector gathered the greatest concentration of armored forces in the entire campaign. It consisted of the 2nd and 4th Armies, plus the 2nd and 3rd Panzer Groups, the pillars of the German strategy to reach Minsk and then Smolensk in an extremely short time. It was the sector that was to receive the main blow, since it was expected that the largest part of the Red Army deployed near the border would be concentrated there. The final objective was to prepare the way to Moscow. In the south, Army Group South, headed by Gerd von Rundstedt, had the most complex mission from a geographical point of view: to advance across Ukraine, cross massive rivers such as the Bug and the Dnieper, and defeat a numerically considerable enemy. It included the 6th, 11th and 17th Armies, together with the 1st Panzer Group. In addition, it had to coordinate with the Romanian forces that aspired to recover territories lost in 1940. Although this sector was crucial because of its economic importance, Hitler underestimated the difficulty of the terrain and the depth of Soviet defenses in the region. At 0 hour, the offensive began with a massive artillery bombardment and simultaneous airstrikes. The Luftwaffe, repeating the tactic used in France, focused on destroying Soviet aviation on the ground. In just 48 hours, more than 1,000 Soviet aircraft were put out of action, a devastating blow that left the sky over the Eastern Front almost completely in German hands. This air dominance allowed the armored forces to advance rapidly, outflanking positions, crossing forests and rivers with the intention of encircling large Soviet formations before they could withdraw into the interior. The initial speed exceeded expectations. In the north, the German divisions quickly crossed Lithuania and Latvia, forcing the Soviets to abandon fortified positions they had no time to use. Large columns of refugees, civilians and soldiers mingled on the roads, hindering movements and worsening the chaos. The Wehrmacht interpreted these scenes as signs that Soviet defeat was only a matter of weeks. In the center, the advance was even more spectacular. The panzer groups of Hoth and Guderian penetrated deep into enemy territory, breaking the front at several points simultaneously. Within days, vast Soviet contingents were trapped in enveloping maneuvers. The city of Minsk fell on the 28th of June, and with it thousands of soldiers were captured in one of the first great encirclements of the campaign. Photographs of endless lines of Soviet prisoners reinforced the German illusion of a rapid triumph. The south advanced more slowly, due to the size of the territory, more organized resistance and the need to coordinate operations with the Romanians. Even so, the overall pace was enough to convince Hitler that the campaign was proceeding according to plan. The open and fertile Ukrainian terrain offered favorable conditions for the mechanized divisions, but the distance between objectives and the strength of the Dnieper as a natural barrier would soon begin to demand a logistical effort far greater than Germany had foreseen. The first weeks of Barbarossa produced deep ruptures that seemed to confirm the thesis of the colossus with feet of clay. But the speed concealed a structural problem. The further the German divisions advanced, the more their supply lines stretched, the more the vehicles wore out, and the more success depended on the precarious maintenance of dirt roads that had not been designed for such massive military traffic. The gigantic German deployment had managed to penetrate like a knife into the Soviet border. However, the real battle was only just beginning. Behind the initial successes, the great encirclements of the first weeks would mark a critical stage in which the German model of lightning war reached its maximum expression and, at the same time, revealed its limitations. The first days of Operation Barbarossa showed the world the most extreme execution of the German warfare method developed since the 1930s, a combination of rapid penetrations, deep envelopments and total destruction of enemy forces in gigantic encirclement movements. The strategy sought to avoid prolonged linear battles and instead collapse the Red Army through strikes at its neuralgic points, disrupting commands, communications and maneuvering capacity. This doctrine, perfected in Poland and France, reached its most brutal expression on the Eastern Front. The penetration, the first phase of the maneuver, consisted of concentrating armoured groups in narrow sectors of the front, where artillery and the Luftwaffe opened breaches before the advance. The tanks did not stop to clear positions or secure the flanks. They pressed forward, seeking strategic depth. This left the infantry units the task of finishing off the isolated enemies. In Barbarossa, this tactic worked in a fulminating manner due to the initial surprise and Soviet organizational chaos. On the very first day, the panzer groups of Hoth and Guderian advanced tens of kilometers eastward, overrunning defensive lines that had no time to coordinate. The second phase, the envelopment, was the heart of the German method. Once the armored columns had pierced the Soviet lines, they turned north or south to converge behind the enemy, creating gigantic pockets. Speed was essential. If the Red Army managed to withdraw before the encirclement closed, the plan lost effectiveness. In France, there had been spectacular advances, but in the Soviet Union, the size of the opposing forces was incomparably greater. The OKH trusted that the magnitude of the encirclements would be sufficient to destroy the bulk of the Red Army in the first weeks. The first great example of this method was the encirclement of Białystok-Minsk, which began in the very first days of the invasion. After breaking the Soviet front at several points, the German panzer groups advanced with a rapidity that exceeded their own calculations. On the Soviet side, the Western Front, commanded by General Dmitry Pavlov, was overwhelmed before it could reorganize its divisions. Contradictory orders, the destruction of communications and the lack of initiative among commanders, the product of years of purges and political terror, contributed to an almost immediate collapse. Guderian advanced northeast while Hoth descended from the north, closing a gigantic pincer around Białystok and a few days later around Minsk. The size of the encirclement was so massive that the German forces themselves had difficulty delimiting its edges. Inside the pocket were entire armies, thousands of soldiers, heavy artillery, tanks and improvised supply lines that crumbled under German bombing. Although the Soviets attempted to break the encirclement at several points, coordination was chaotic. Large units withdrew without fuel or ammunition, while others held out in isolated positions, unaware that the rest of the front had vanished. By the 30th of June, Minsk fell and the encirclement was completely sealed. The figures were colossal. Around 300,000 Soviet soldiers were captured, and thousands more died in combat or during the retreat. The magnitude of the disaster even exceeded the expectations of the German High Command. Images of endless columns of exhausted, wounded Soviet prisoners, many without even basic equipment, reinforced the Nazi narrative that the war was practically won. Hitler celebrated the encirclement as definitive proof of the military and racial inferiority of the enemy, feeding his conviction that the Soviet Union would collapse before winter arrived. But the strategic reality was less obvious than it appeared. Although the Białystok-Minsk encirclement represented an immense victory, it also revealed the first symptoms of German wear. The tanks that had covered hundreds of kilometers were showing mechanical failures, supplies were insufficient to maintain the pace of advance, and the infantry, which had to close the pockets and hold the lines, was beginning to lag behind. The Luftwaffe, crucial in the opening days, was already experiencing strain in its ability to operate over such vast distances. Moreover, the destruction of the Soviet Western Front did not provoke the political collapse that Hitler imagined. Instead of crumbling, the Soviet state began mobilizing new reserves, transferring divisions from the interior and preparing deeper defensive lines. The fall of Minsk did not break the will to fight, it intensified it. Stalin ordered defense at all costs and accelerated the reorganization of the army, replacing incompetent commanders and redirecting industrial resources toward the Urals. The dawn of the 22nd of June 1941 fell upon the Soviet Union like a blow that no one, not even within Stalin's inner circle, had managed to anticipate clearly. Although intelligence warnings existed, the Kremlin refused to believe that Germany would start a total war while still fighting Great Britain. The result was widespread bewilderment when German artillery opened fire and the Luftwaffe launched thousands of sorties against airfields and railway junctions. The Red Army, caught between contradictory orders, took hours to react and days to grasp the scale of the attack. In many sectors of the front, the Soviets lacked clear instructions. Some units resisted with desperate courage, others were overrun before they could organize. Combat manuals were outdated, and much of the military leadership had been swept away by the Stalinist purges. Distrust paralyzed initiative. A commander who acted without explicit orders could be accused of treason. This bureaucratic rigidity clashed head-on with German tactical flexibility, especially in the first days. Communications collapsed while Soviet divisions were encircled or scattered, generating a chaos that Nazi propaganda exploited to build the image of a disorganized enemy in permanent retreat. However, behind that triumphalist narrative, German logistical reality was already beginning to show cracks. The Barbarossa plan had been designed on the assumption of a short war. The armored units advanced so quickly that the supply trains could not keep pace. The roads, many of them mere dirt tracks, turned into quagmires under the passage of thousands of vehicles. In the first weeks, 1/3 of the German tanks were put out of action by mechanical failures, lack of maintenance or minor breakdowns that could not be repaired quickly enough. The Luftwaffe, although dominant in the skies, faced distances that exceeded its operational capacity. Improvised airfields were left too far behind the front, and pilots flew continuous missions without rest. The initial attacks on Soviet airfields were devastating, but not sufficient to completely destroy the enemy's air capability, which began dispersing its units and operating from deeper bases. Meanwhile, German propaganda insisted that the Red Army was on the verge of collapse. Newsreels showed endless columns of prisoners, destroyed Soviet tanks, and captured cities. The official narrative repeated that the campaign had entered its final phase, even when German commanders themselves were seeing worrying signs. The High Command hid these reports from Hitler, fearing his reaction. The divergences between the propagandistic story and operational reality were becoming ever more evident. Among those signs, one of the most alarming was the scale of the enemy. Every time the Wehrmacht destroyed a Soviet army, another appeared behind it. The reserves that Stalin mobilized from the interior of the country seemed inexhaustible. Furthermore, the Red Army showed an unexpected capacity for recomposition amid the chaos. Newly formed units arrived at the front without adequate training, but with a resistance that surprised the German commanders. The political fanaticism imposed by the commissars and the terror of the NKVD forces ensured that retreat was minimal and combat ferocious. Another structural problem arose from the very design of Barbarossa. Since the German forces had been divided into 3 large independent army groups, there was no clear center of gravity. The lack of a priority objective meant that resources were dispersed. Army Group Center advanced faster than the others, creating a dangerous gap on its flanks, while the North and South faced more difficult obstacles and progressed at different rates. This lack of synchronization complicated cooperation and increased vulnerability to Soviet counterattacks. On the ground, German soldiers discovered that reality was very different from the image that propaganda had sold them. The cities were vast, the distances impossible, the roads unpredictable, and civilian resistance stronger than expected. Many had hoped to be welcomed as liberators by Ukrainian or Belarusian peasants, but they soon realized that the extremely brutal occupation policies eliminated any possibility of spontaneous collaboration. War without rules, Barbarossa as a project of extermination. Operation Barbarossa was not conceived solely as a military campaign. From its origins, Hitler and the Nazi High Command designed it as an ideological, racial and extermination war, where the rules of conventional warfare would be replaced by decrees that legitimized unlimited violence against Soviet soldiers and civilians. Even before the first tank crossed the border, the political and military apparatus of the Reich had set in motion a set of criminal orders intended to dehumanize the enemy and grant immunity to those who carried out atrocities. These orders were not accessory tools. They were a constitutive part of the invasion plan. The best known and most decisive of these directives was the Kommissar Order or Kommissarbefehl, issued on the 6th of June 1941. It instructed German troops to summarily execute all captured Soviet political commissars, identified by their uniform and red armband. For Hitler, the commissars embodied the ideological core of Jewish Bolshevism, and their presence in the Soviet army turned every battle into a racial confrontation. The text of the order was explicit. Commissars were not to be treated as prisoners of war, but as political instigators whose elimination was indispensable for the success of the campaign. The psychological impact of this order was immediate. Many professional officers considered it a flagrant violation of the laws of war, but the climate of blind obedience and fear of reprisals for disobeying the Führer's instructions prevented any effective protest. In the first days of Barbarossa, thousands of commissars were executed in the very fields where their units surrendered, a brutal prelude to the growing dehumanization of the enemy. Complementing this directive, the Barbarossa Jurisdiction Decree, or Barbarossa Dreieck, established that German troops had authority to execute any Soviet civilian suspected of resistance, sabotage, or mere hostility. The broad and imprecise definition of these grounds allowed soldiers and officers to justify practically any act of violence. Villages in combat zones could be burned if partisan activity was suspected, and inhabitants subjected to violent interrogations without judicial oversight. The entire occupied Soviet territory was placed outside the scope of any international law. The most revealing measure, however, was the criminal exemption for German soldiers who committed crimes against civilians. According to this decree, issued by the OKW, acts committed by the Wehrmacht against non-combatants were not to be prosecuted in court. Sanctions would only be imposed internally if the crime affected troop discipline, but never because of its impact on the local population. In practice, this order granted a license to kill. For many soldiers, especially young ones indoctrinated in Nazi anti-Semitism and anti-communism, it meant a moral release that turned them into willing executors of mass violence. These orders, far from being applied in a vacuum, were part of a larger system in which the Wehrmacht actively collaborated with the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile extermination squads tasked with eliminating Jews, political commissars, Roma, and Soviet intellectuals. Although post-war propaganda attempted to present the Wehrmacht as a professional army detached from the genocide, historical documentation proves the opposite. German divisions facilitated the transport, isolation, registration and guarding of entire populations that were later handed over to the Einsatzgruppen for execution. In regions such as Belarus, Ukraine and the Baltic countries, this collaboration became structural. The Wehrmacht reported on the presence of Jewish communities and local communist networks, protected the squads during their operations, and in many cases participated directly in shootings. Furthermore, racial violence was encouraged from the command level. Soldiers were instructed to view Soviets as subhumans whose elimination would strengthen the German future in the East. Thus, genocide was not a marginal phenomenon, but an integrated component of the military machine. The practical consequence of these orders was that, from the very first month of Barbarossa, the German rear area turned into a scene of systematic murders. Entire villages were razed on the slightest suspicion. Men, women and children were executed for failing to cooperate with requisitions, and thousands of Jews were rounded up in forests and fields to be shot in mass graves. This mass violence not only devastated local populations, but also radicalized Soviet resistance. Any hope of collaboration vanished when civilians realized that German occupation meant exploitation, deportation or death. In Belarus, operations by the Einsatzgruppen and the Wehrmacht were directed from day one toward eliminating Jews, commissars, and anyone suspected of collaborating with the Soviet state. Cities such as Minsk, Vitebsk or Mogilev became centers of mass shootings. The tactics were simple and deadly. The targeted population was gathered, led to nearby forests or pre-dug pits, and methodically executed with the support of regular military units. The local population, terrified and subjected to collective reprisals, watched as entire villages were destroyed on suspicion of partisan activity. The phenomenon of burnt villages, towns wiped off the map by fire and shooting, multiplied within months, turning Belarus into one of the most devastated regions of the war. In Ukraine, where the Nazis had hoped to gain support after years of Soviet repression, the extermination policy destroyed any possibility of collaboration. The arrival of German troops was followed by pogroms encouraged or tolerated by the occupation, especially in cities such as Lviv, where hundreds of Jews were murdered in a matter of days. The best-known episode took place at Babi Yar, a ravine on the outskirts of Kiev, where between September and October 1941, the Einsatzgruppen, with logistical support from the Wehrmacht, murdered more than 33,000 Jews in 2 days, and tens of thousands more in the following months. This was one of the largest mass shootings of the Second World War and marked a point of consolidation in the Nazi genocide even before the industrial gas chambers were put into operation. The Baltic countries experienced a similar dynamic. In Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, some nationalist groups initially collaborated, believing the Germans would free the region from Soviet domination. However, Nazi racial policy made no distinction between Slavs and Balts. All were destined for subjugation. The Jewish population was exterminated with horrifying speed. In Kaunas, Riga and Vilna, thousands of people were executed in the first months. Improvised extermination sites in forests such as Ponary became scenes of daily slaughter. Local collaborators facilitated the identification of victims, while the Wehrmacht provided perimeter security, transport and logistical support. In addition to violence against civilians, one of the most brutal dimensions of Barbarossa was the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war. Germany captured millions in the first months. Only between June and December 1941, approximately 3 million Soviet soldiers fell into Wehrmacht hands. Far from receiving the minimum treatment guaranteed by international conventions, they were subjected to a planned extermination by neglect. Nazi ideology held that Soviet prisoners, especially those of Slavic or Jewish origin, had no value whatsoever. The goal was to let them die of hunger, disease, or exposure to the elements. Death marches began from the very first day. Prisoners were forced to walk hundreds of kilometers without food, water, or rest. Those who collapsed were shot by the roadside. German testimonies describe scenes in which the routes were marked by bodies every few meters. In the improvised prisoner camps, conditions were no better. Barbed wire enclosures were erected in open fields, with no barracks, no sanitary facilities, and no food storage. German guards distributed only the barest rations, enough merely to prolong the agony. Planned starvation was a central component of this system. The directive known as the Hunger Plan established that Soviet food resources were to be diverted to Germany, even if this meant the starvation death of millions of people in the occupied territories. Prisoners of war were the first victims. In the winter of 1941, hundreds of thousands died frozen or weakened to the point of being unable to move. By the following spring, approximately two-thirds of all prisoners captured in 1941 were dead. The combination of executions, abandonment and forced exploitation turned prisoner camps into centers of mass death. Camps such as Darnitsia in Kiev or Bobruisk in Belarus concentrated tens of thousands of corpses. In some cases, prisoners were handed directly to the Einsatzgruppen if they were identified as Jews, commissars or representatives of the Soviet elite. Another of the most devastating features was the organized looting of resources. Even before the start of Barbarossa, Hitler had decided that the Soviet population had to be sacrificed to keep Germany supplied. Logistical orders established that food, fuel and captured materials were to be sent as a priority to the Reich. This meant that villages, farms and cities were stripped of everything essential: livestock, wheat, agricultural machinery, clothing, tools and even furniture. The massive requisition of food caused famines across entire regions, especially in Ukraine and Belarus, where millions were left without means of subsistence. The occupation policy also established systems of forced labor, in which men and women were compelled to perform agricultural tasks, build roads or repair destroyed infrastructure. Thousands were deported to Germany as slave labor for the war industry. Working conditions were brutal. Shifts of more than 12 hours, insufficient food and disciplinary punishments that included torture and public executions. Human life had no value in the face of the absolute priority of maintaining the pace of the war. As the German occupation intensified, the first forms of civil and guerrilla resistance emerged. In many rural areas, civilians joined improvised groups that attacked convoys, cut telegraph lines and hid retreating Soviet soldiers. In Belarus, where the brutality was most intense, the guerrilla movement became massive. By the end of 1941, thousands of partisans were operating from the forests, supported by villages that had little left to lose. The German response was merciless. Entire villages were burned and their inhabitants executed on charges of supporting the partisans. Collective crime became the norm of the occupation. Resistance was also fed by German behavior itself. The initial promise by some nationalist sectors that Germany would free them from Soviet rule quickly vanished. Nazi racism, which regarded all these populations as inferior, eliminated any possibility of lasting collaboration. The policies of extermination and looting revealed that the occupation did not seek to emancipate anyone, but to impose a rigid racial hierarchy in which the local inhabitants were expendable. Disillusionment was immediate and total. Further north in Leningrad and its surroundings, the impact on civilians reached extreme levels. Although the total siege would come later, forced evacuations, constant bombing and the methodical destruction of military and civilian facilities had already begun from the summer of 1941. The population was left isolated between the front lines and the sea, subjected to a German strategy aimed at eliminating the city through starvation. In this context, the myth of the clean Wehrmacht began to crack. For decades, a narrative tried to separate the Wehrmacht from the crimes committed by the SS and the Einsatzgruppen. But historical documents are irrefutable. The regular army actively participated in shootings, deportations, looting and reprisals. Criminal orders were not only carried out by special units, they depended on the military infrastructure of the army, which provided transport, information and security. In many cases, Wehrmacht soldiers directly executed civilians under generic accusations of sabotage or collaboration with partisans. Records of German divisions showed detailed reports of burned villages, summary executions and massive confiscations. Some commanders protested or tried to curb the abuses, but they were a minority. The majority accepted this policy as an integral part of the war, influenced by racial indoctrination that justified the extermination of entire populations. On occasion, they even competed with the SS squads to demonstrate initiative in repressive tasks. Indiscriminate violence strengthened something Hitler never anticipated: Soviet resistance, which acquired a nationalist and desperate character. German brutality demolished any possibility of negotiated surrender. It transformed the war into an absolute confrontation where the enemy saw only two options: fight or die. The halted advance, Smolensk, Ukraine, and the end of the German impulse. As the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into the Soviet Union, distance itself began to turn into an enemy as dangerous as the Red Army. The very design of Operation Barbarossa, conceived as a lightning war, assumed that victory would be achieved before logistics became a critical factor. However, as German tanks penetrated hundreds of kilometers into hostile territory, reality proved that the Reich's military apparatus was not prepared to sustain a prolonged campaign across such a vast and precarious geography. The most immediate problem was fuel. German armored vehicles consumed enormous quantities of petrol, and every additional kilometer multiplied supply needs. Captured railway lines could not be used immediately. The Soviet Union employed a different track gauge from the European one, forcing troops to dismantle and rebuild entire sections before heavy material could be moved. This delay meant that most transport had to be done by road, using trucks that wore out quickly and could not be replaced at the required rate. The Soviet roads, in reality mere dirt tracks, could not withstand the weight of thousands of vehicles. In the first weeks of summer, the dust was so thick that it hampered visibility and damaged engines. When it rained, those tracks turned into quagmires that slowed mobility almost to a halt. The famous Rasputitsa, although still distant on the calendar, was already making itself felt in regions where infrastructure was minimal. On numerous occasions, the tanks advanced so far ahead of the rest of the army that their supplies took days to arrive, leaving units isolated and vulnerable. Overextension became a widespread phenomenon. The divisions pushed deep but failed to fully secure their flanks or consolidate positions. The rear thus turned into an unstable space plagued by sabotage, partisan attacks, and the deliberate destruction of infrastructure by the retreating Soviets. The Wehrmacht, designed for short and decisive blows, lacked the organizational capacity to control such vast territories. The distance between the army groups grew larger every day, making cooperation more difficult and further fragmenting the offensive. In this context, the wear and tear on equipment reached alarming levels. By the end of July, some divisions had lost up to 50% of their vehicles due to mechanical failures. The Luftwaffe was also suffering. Improvised airfields lacked sufficient fuel, the distance to targets kept increasing, and pilot fatigue was beginning to take its toll. Although it remained superior to Soviet aviation, its ability to sustain continuous operations was declining rapidly. The German army also lacked adequate spare parts. Many of the German tanks were different models, Panzer III, Panzer IV, Czech models or captured French tanks, that required mutually incompatible parts and ammunition. This complicated maintenance and meant that entire units were halted for lack of even a minor component. Furthermore, the Wehrmacht depended 80% on horse-drawn transport, a fact that contrasted dramatically with the image of modernity projected by propaganda. Barbarossa, despite its mechanized appearance, was to a large extent a 19th-century campaign in logistical terms. The German advance also collided with Soviet strategic depth, a feature that Hitler had completely underestimated. Every time the Red Army lost a front, it retreated hundreds of kilometers and reorganized its lines. The Soviet command moved entire industries to the Urals, beyond German reach. Factories dismantled in Kiev, Kharkov or Leningrad reappeared months later producing tanks and ammunition. This colossal effort ensured that the Soviet Union could rebuild its military capacity, even after immense losses. At the same time, the Soviet Union introduced a continuous reorganization of the Red Army. Despite the initial chaos, Stalin and his general staff began to regain control. Competent generals such as Zhukov, Rokossovsky or Timoshenko assumed greater responsibilities. New divisions emerged from the interior, made up of recruits who arrived with little proper training, but with a level of motivation that bewildered the German command. Moreover, internal discipline was drastically hardened. Deserters were executed, commissars re-established political control, and defensive lines were fortified even under desperate conditions. The weeks of the summer of 1941 marked a silent but decisive turning point in Operation Barbarossa. Although the Wehrmacht continued to advance and rack up territorial victories, the character of the campaign began to change. From July onward, Soviet resistance ceased to be scattered chaos and became an organized defense that was, at times, surprisingly tenacious. The great battles of Smolensk, the start of the siege of Leningrad, and the massive fighting in Ukraine revealed for the first time that the quick war imagined by Hitler was crumbling, while the real weight of the German effort was beginning to sink the offensive. The Battle of Smolensk, fought between July and August, was the first major obstacle on the road to Moscow. After the encirclement at Białystok-Minsk, Army Group Center expected to advance toward the Soviet capital without major difficulties. However, the forces of Timoshenko and Zhukov managed to organize a compact defense around Smolensk, forcing the Germans to fight for weeks on an irregular and complex front. Although the Wehrmacht succeeded in closing a new encirclement and capturing tens of thousands of prisoners, the advance was significantly delayed. The human cost also began to become visible. The fighting around Smolensk caused a constant bloodletting. Entire units suffered losses that could not be replaced. The panzer divisions, which had begun the campaign with around 150 tanks each, now often had only 40 or 50 operational. The infantry advanced, exhausted, always lagging behind the pace set by the armor. Every kilometer gained was the result of fierce fighting. Meanwhile, farther north, a battle of transcendental consequences was unfolding. Army Group North advanced toward Leningrad through Estonia and Latvia, forcing the Red Army to fall back toward the defenses of the former imperial capital. The German objective was to capture the city and destroy one of the symbolic centers of communism. However, Soviet resistance and the complexity of the terrain slowed the advance. By August, the Germans had reached the outskirts of the city, but failed to take it by storm. Hitler, frustrated, then decided to besiege Leningrad and let the population die of hunger, inaugurating one of the most atrocious episodes of the war. Although the complete encirclement would be consolidated later, the summer of 1941 already showed the German inability to seize strategic objectives without disproportionate costs. The Southern Front offered an even more dramatic picture. In Ukraine, the Red Army deployed a larger force than Hitler had anticipated. The region, vital for the Reich's economic plans, became the scene of prolonged battles. Cities such as Kiev, Uman and Kharkov were defended with ferocity. Although German and Romanian forces achieved important advances, the attrition was enormous. The vast expanse of terrain, the rivers that had to be crossed, and the immense Soviet presence multiplied the logistical difficulties. The Dnieper, a natural barrier of enormous proportions, slowed the advance and forced German engineers to build improvised bridges under constant fire. The Wehrmacht suffered more than 200,000 casualties between July and August, a figure that shattered the illusion of a cost-free victory. These losses, which included the dead, the wounded and the missing, hit the infantry units especially hard, already weakened by forced marches and extreme heat. The huge number of wounded overwhelmed medical services and delayed unit rotation. German casualties were not just a statistic, they directly affected the operational capacity of every division. The war also revealed the true material face of the German army. The image of a fully mechanized Wehrmacht was, to a large extent, propaganda. Although tanks and armored vehicles dominated the newsreels, the bulk of the logistical effort depended on the 600,000 horses that Germany brought to the Eastern Front. These animals transported cannons, ammunition, food, spare parts, and in many cases the soldiers themselves. The massive use of horses made the Wehrmacht extremely vulnerable to distance, weather and attrition. When the animals died of exhaustion, hunger or disease, units were paralyzed. Dependence on traditional methods limited Germany's ability to sustain prolonged advances across such an immense territory. Moreover, with each passing day, the Red Army brought fresh divisions from the interior. The Soviet Union was mobilizing unsuspected reserves, moving entire industries to the Urals and rebuilding whole fronts in a matter of weeks. The enemy Hitler had described as a feeble giant was proving an industrial and human resilience that surpassed all German forecasts. By the end of the summer of 1941, while the Wehrmacht continued to advance but already showed signs of profound exhaustion, Hitler began to intervene ever more directly in the strategic conduct of the campaign. That shift, based more on ideological impulses and personal perceptions than on military criteria, altered the course of Barbarossa at a critical moment. The Führer, convinced that the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse, decided to change the main objectives without regard for the real state of his forces or the true scale of the enemy. These erratic decisions ended up fracturing the German offensive and sealing the failure of the plan's central premise to defeat the Soviet Union in 4 to 6 weeks. The first breaking point came after the Battle of Smolensk. Army Group Center, under von Bock's command, was pressing to advance straight toward Moscow. Generals Halder, Guderian and Höpner insisted that the Soviet capital was the nerve center of the entire system. Capturing it would cut essential railway lines, paralyze the enemy's military command, and trigger a political crisis that could break Soviet resistance. Moreover, the Red Army had shown an ability to reorganize. Unless its logistical and administrative capacity was destroyed, it would keep raising new fronts. But Hitler did not share that view. From his ideological perspective, the key was not Moscow but Ukraine. He believed that control of agricultural resources and the Donbas coal would be decisive for sustaining a long war. The obsession with food self-sufficiency and Lebensraum overrode every military argument. That is why, at the end of July, he ordered the center's panzer groups to swing south in order to close huge pockets in Ukraine instead of pushing toward Moscow. This decision provoked an internal confrontation. Guderian traveled personally to Hitler's headquarters to protest, but he was ignored. Meanwhile, the Northern Front demanded attention. Hitler believed that the fall of Leningrad would have a devastating psychological impact and eliminate a key communication hub with the Western Allies. He ordered resources diverted to Army Group North, further weakening the concentration in the center. The result was extreme strategic dispersion. While some armies turned toward the Baltic, others toward Ukraine, and only a portion kept the course toward Moscow. The so-called Operation Typhoon began only in October, too late to secure the capital before winter. The autumn rains had already turned the roads into seas of mud, and the Wehrmacht now faced a Soviet resistance that was far tougher and better organized than in June. The opportunity that had existed in midsummer had evaporated. The underlying reason for these decisions was Hitler's conviction that the Soviet Union was about to collapse. The initial premise of Barbarossa, that is, the fragility of the Soviet regime, had led the Führer to completely underestimate Soviet mobilization capacity. The constant reappearance of armies that he believed destroyed was not interpreted as signs of strength, but as temporary irregularities. Every German victory, even when it cost thousands of casualties, reinforced his illusion that the total defeat of the Soviet Union was only weeks away. This belief led to another fatal decision: the refusal to prioritize logistics. Hitler rejected slowing the advance to allow supply lines to consolidate. He dismissed warnings from his commanders about shortages of fuel, spare parts and ammunition. He insisted on an impossible pace, convinced that the enemy's destruction had to be completed before winter altered combat conditions. This irrational optimism turned the campaign into a race against time that Germany could not win. The end of the Nazi dream of conquering the East. At the beginning of October 1941, after months of strategic indecision and operational detours, Hitler ordered the final blow against Moscow, Operation Typhoon. It was the last attempt to fulfill the original fantasy of Barbarossa, to take the Soviet capital before winter, definitively destroy the Red Army, and force the communist regime to collapse. The German High Command trusted that it could repeat the formula that had worked at Minsk, Smolensk and Kiev: rapid penetration, massive encirclement and destruction of enemy forces before they could reorganize. But this time the Wehrmacht would face conditions that no operations manual had foreseen, and that no German general could control. The plan began with two gigantic maneuvers intended to encircle and eliminate the main Soviet fronts defending the approach to Moscow. In the north of Army Group Center, the troops of Hoth and Hopner advanced toward Vyazma, while further south Guderian's forces headed for Bryansk. In theory, these maneuvers were supposed to open a direct corridor to Moscow. In practice, they became some of the bloodiest operations of early autumn. The encirclements were in fact tactically successful. At Vyazma, 4 Soviet armies were completely surrounded. At Bryansk, another large group was isolated by the rapid German advance. Between both pockets, more than 600,000 Soviet soldiers were captured or killed in just 2 weeks. It was a devastating figure, an enlarged repetition of the Kiev disaster. From a strictly military perspective, the Germans had achieved one of the greatest operational victories of the entire campaign. However, the strategic impact was far less than expected. Unlike the early months, the Soviet Union now had organized reserves behind Moscow. Stalin not only refused to evacuate the city, but declared total defense, imposed martial law and mobilized hundreds of thousands of civilians to dig trenches around the capital. With each passing day, new divisions arrived from Siberia and the Far East, where Soviet intelligence had confirmed that Japan would not attack. The Wehrmacht was advancing, but it was no longer destroying the Soviet defensive structure. It was simply pushing it back. That was when nature intervened decisively. In mid-October, torrential rains began that turned the front into an endless expanse of liquid mud. The dreaded Rasputitsa, which veterans remembered from Napoleon's campaign, paralyzed the German advance. Dirt roads dissolved into deep quagmires where tanks sank up to their turrets, and horses died of exhaustion trying to drag artillery pieces. Trucks sank, wheels spun without traction, and infantry advanced at a desperate pace, carrying weapons and packs soaked in mud up to their waists. German mobility, the central pillar of the Blitzkrieg doctrine, collapsed completely. The armored columns that in June had advanced tens of kilometers per day now moved barely 2 or 3 in entire days of effort. The Luftwaffe, unable to operate from flooded airfields, lost its ability to provide air support. Supply convoys took days to reach forward positions, if they arrived at all. The offensive became an exhausting struggle against merciless terrain that devoured engines, wheels, animals, and men. When the mud finally began to harden, creating the illusion that the advance could resume, the second devastating blow arrived: the Russian winter, early and brutal. In November, temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Celsius, and by the end of the month they reached -30 degrees Celsius in several sectors of the front. The Wehrmacht, designed for a 6-week summer campaign, was not equipped for extreme conditions. The soldiers lacked winter uniforms, gloves, suitable boots, and sufficient blankets. Many slept in the open or in improvised shelters, wrapped in light greatcoats that offered no real protection against the cold. War material also began to fail on an alarming scale. Weapons froze. German lubricants, formulated for temperate climates, became as thick as wax. Rifle bolts jammed, anti-tank guns would not fire, machine guns stopped working. Vehicles, especially petrol engines, refused to start. The Germans lit fires under tank engines to try to warm them, risking accidental fires. Tires cracked like glass, rations froze solid inside packs. The Red Army, by contrast, was prepared. Wool clothing, lined boots, special grease for weapons, vehicles better adapted to the cold, and thousands of skiers who moved swiftly through deep snow. The Wehrmacht, which in June had been the most formidable offensive force in the world, was now exhausted, weakened, and frozen at the gates of Moscow. By late November 1941, as the Wehrmacht approached the outskirts of Moscow, the German offensive was spent in every sense, physically, logistically, and morally. The soldiers advanced at a slow pace, with insufficient clothing, frozen weapons, and fuel supplies that arrived with ever greater difficulty. The offensive that was supposed to have crushed the Soviet Union in a matter of weeks had turned into an agonizing race against winter, and it was in that setting that the decisive figure would enter the scene, Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov had been transferred from Leningrad to the Western Front to coordinate the defense of Moscow at the most critical moment of the entire war. His arrival meant a complete reorganization of the Soviet disposition. Unlike the initial chaos of June, the Red Army now had more cohesive units, experienced officers, and a more stable command structure. Zhukov imposed iron discipline, consolidated defensive positions, reorganized reserves, and, above all, coordinated the massive use of artillery to halt the German advance at key points along the front. Meanwhile, Stalin made a momentous political decision. He chose to remain in Moscow. He rejected any suggestion of evacuating the capital, convinced that his presence was essential for the country's morale. He ordered civilians to build defensive lines by hand, while hundreds of thousands of soldiers were rushed to the area. The entire city prepared for house-to-house fighting if necessary. To this defensive effort was added a crucial event on the strategic level of the conflict, the arrival of the Siberian divisions. With confirmation from Richard Sorge, the legendary Soviet spy in Tokyo, that Japan had no plans to attack the Soviet Union, Stalin was able to transfer elite troops from the Far East. These units were equipped for winter, trained to fight in extreme conditions, and made up of soldiers accustomed to temperatures of -40 degrees Celsius. Their presence radically transformed the balance on the Moscow front. By early December, German forces had reached distances from which the city's domes could be seen. But they could advance no further. The combination of extreme cold, lack of supplies, exhaustion, and Soviet resistance had turned the offensive into a futile effort. Hitler continued to order attacks that his generals knew were impossible. The panzer units were immobilized, and the infantry suffered massive frostbite. The offensive force that had swept through Western Europe was now practically paralyzed. The Soviet counter-offensive began on the 5th of December 1941. Zhukov ordered a broad offensive along the entire Moscow front. For the first time since the start of Barbarossa, the Red Army shifted from defense to attack. The Siberian divisions led the assaults, taking advantage of their mobility in deep snow. The Germans, unable to hold the front, began to retreat. The withdrawal was not orderly. Thousands of soldiers froze to death in exposed positions, unable to move or fire their weapons. Entire vehicles were abandoned on the icy roads. The German line fell back between 100 and 250 kilometers, a retreat that destroyed any possibility of capturing Moscow. Hitler, furious, ordered that no position be abandoned without direct permission, thereby condemning thousands of soldiers to die frozen or surrounded by the Soviets. His inflexibility worsened the disaster. By January 1942, the Wehrmacht was exhausted. More than 500,000 casualties since October, thousands of vehicles put out of action, and morale shattered. The myth of German invincibility had burst. In strategic terms, the failure of Barbarossa was sealed that winter. Germany had lost its best chance to destroy the Soviet Union. It not only failed to take Moscow, but also failed to break Soviet industrial capacity, destroy its military reserves, or shatter the political cohesion of the regime. The factories relocated to the Urals were beginning to produce thousands of T-34 tanks and light weapons. The Red Army had demonstrated a resilience unimaginable to the German command. But the failure was not only military, it was ideological. Barbarossa had been conceived as a racial war intended to annihilate the Slavic and Jewish Untermenschentum, a project meant to consolidate German dominion over Europe. Instead, it produced a Soviet and popular reaction that multiplied resistance and turned the conflict into a total war. German brutality in the occupied territories united millions of people against the invader. The Wehrmacht not only failed to achieve a decisive victory, it sowed the seeds of its own long-term defeat.